Hi, to make the image you see here, which is a mosaic of many photos put together to cover the expanse of the Orion Nebula, I'm using a program called Nuke, which is a professional visual effects piece of software that I use in my day job. But I found out that through trial and error and trying to use Photoshop for this kind of thing as a first resource, that I felt like Nuke was better suited for specifically this type of mosaic creation, for a variety of reasons I'll go over as I explain quickly how this was put together. So in Nuke, things work in a node structure. So this is what the interface of Nuke kind of looks like. All of these are nodes. Each different colored square you see is a different operation. And the way it works is kind of like a flow chart where you start at the top and the data for the image flows down through all of these different nodes, and each node is performing a different operation of all different kinds, whether it's color corrections or masks or resizes, things like that that adjust either the color or the geometry of how the images are put together. So starting at the top, we have here, which is a mosaic that was already put together of a few starting images. So these were put together in Photoshop and Pixinsight and some other software that my dad Steve had done on his end. And then as we continued forward, he kept taking more photos. He started sending them to me to put together. And so he sent me this one to kind of start off with. And I did a few initial things to it, like see all of these blue nodes labeled grade. If I double click one, the interface comes up here. These are the sort of adjustments I can make in this node specifically, which is all just color corrections. Basically, these grade nodes do color corrections. So I'm taking the black point down and doing a few other things to kind of blend the different images in the mosaic together a little bit better, get rid of some of the junk that's like, artifacts from the outside of the image that occur in the mosaic process in the software he was using. And you can kind of see before and after here. It's just bringing out some additional detail, adding some contrast, and kind of trying to blend some of the areas a little bit better where maybe the black point wasn't quite what it should be compared to the other photos and how they were processed. So that initial pass just kind of evens out some of those differences, and there's still some other things that could be worked on even at this point. And then as we go down and you see these branches going off to the left, these are new images that are coming in. So here's an image that he took that he sent to me. And I did a similar thing where I did a grade, which just adjusts the gamma and the gain and basic, black and white color corrections to kind of, increase contrast and bring out some detail. Get rid of some noise in certain areas by crushing it out into the darker parts of the sky where you should just see, dark sky and not noise. And then we have this node, which I used a lot, and this is one of the things I really love about using Nuke is it's called a grid warp node. And what this does is it puts up a grid across the image. And at the points where the grid intersects, you can click and drag to move the image around. Which if I look at it, you can see I can click and drag and it'll warp the image in that specific local area. Photoshop has tools that do this, and lots of other programs do as well. What I like about the way Nuke does it is it stays nicely editable as long as anytime I want to come back to this, I can just come back to this node and adjust. And so down the line, as I do some other transformations to bring that in line with the earlier image that I showed you before, So here's before, and then here's the image after I've added on this other picture that he sent. You can see, we've had to do some rotation to bring it in line with the geometry of this first image. So that's what I'm doing in this node. And then using the grid warp to kind of warp some of the other areas of the image into place because of things like lens distortion, or the geometry was just slightly different between the photos. So to get the stars to all line up and the features of the image to line up, I use the grid warp node along with the larger sort of translations here, like rotations and scale, to bring these on top of each other and line them up. And so as I'm doing this, I can always jump back and say, oh, okay, these stars need to line up better. Well, I'll just go back to the grid warp here and I'll tweak that and I'll get them to line up. And I have control where this node is, the merge node, is where the image is actually added on top of the first one. So this is where, okay, so we've got this pipe coming in, which is the original image I showed before. And then this pipe, the A pipe, comes in and brings on the new image. And in this, I have control over things like opacity. I can fade it up and down and check how well the things are lining up. And again, go back and tweak as much as I need to. I feel like this is, again, something you can do in Photoshop, certainly, but I just like the control that Nuke gives to go back and constantly change and edit as I continue to build the mosaic and realize that things need to be tweaked a little bit. And then you can also, this is one thing that I think Nuke does far better than Photoshop, which is drawing masks. So that's what this node over here is doing. It's controlling how much of this new image that's coming in on the left gets merged over top the old image above it. So if I take this off, you can see here's the hard edges of the new image. And then I've drawn this shape, and where the dotted lines are basically where it's going to fade off. And I can use that shape to then cut off and fade off those hard edges rather than leaving them in and trying to paint them out or something like that. I can use this. And then if I decide I want to adjust it, these are all points that I can click and drag and adjust freely. So it's a nice visual representation of where the mask for the image is, and I can quickly go in and adjust the fade and how things are blending together. So it's nice and interactive, and I can add multiple shapes if I want, and edit to my heart's content until the blend of these two images looks good. So that's all that's happening now from here on down, is basically as my dad took a new image. So here's the next one he took. He would send it over, and he would take these images obviously with a plan of having some overlap in place so that I could line them up. So again, doing the lineup can kind of fade in and out. To check how they're lined up, you can see down here there's a little bit of issue with how they lined up. But I'm going to use this roto shape to mask off the parts that don't line up and keep the stuff that I want to keep and blend them together. So continuing on, adding more images as he took them and sent them to me, and doing the same thing of color correcting, adjusting their geometry and how they're placed and rotated and scaled, and using mask shapes to blend them together. And all along, adjusting what I've done before, in case as I add something new, I notice that something, is misaligned that maybe I didn't notice before. He would also take photos of certain areas that maybe had not as much detail in a different exposure, an earlier exposure he took, so he would send me those, and I could patch those in just the areas where, so in this older image, this area here was, a little bit grainy and not as, didn't highlight the structure and the nebulosity and the gas and dust in this area. So he'd take a new photo and I would just drop that in on top and continue again to do that as he sent me new things, and fill out the mosaic. Again, doing things to try and blend the different images together as they come in. So for example, here he sent me this photo, which I lined up and got in there, and I thought this one had, you know, really nice contrast, and I wanted to not adjust that one as much as like I wanted to leave this one in the top left alone and kind of bring the rest of it up to that level of contrast. So that's what I did here. Like before I'd merged on all this stuff, I could adjust all of the stuff above it, and so I can turn that on and off, and you can see how I've sort of brought those levels of everything else up to match this one. And so it's just a lot of experimenting and adding new photos and seeing what looks best until we've achieved the full mosaic with all of the features, or as much of the features as we could get before Orion was no longer visible high enough in the sky for him to take the kind of long exposure hydrogen alpha filtered photos that he was taking. And then finally, you know, I did a bit of a rotation on the whole thing to kind of get it to fit in a bit more of a rectangular shape, because we're going to hopefully, and we did end up, you know, printing these out onto posters, and crop out, you know, the additional black sort of work area that was in there, so that I had space to move things around, crop that out for the final image. And then this yellow node down here is just outputs the final JPEG render of the final mosaic. So that's basically Nuke in a nutshell, just to do these sort of blends of different images together. Do this kind of stuff a lot in my day job in visual effects, you know, when we're doing 360-degree environments that have been taken from, you know, a bunch of different photos on a movie set, and we need to stitch them together to be used in our CG renders and things like that. So it's a lot of the same techniques applied here, and you know, so I think it's partially, I think Nuke is great for this kind of stuff because of how editable everything remains and how clear the structure of the work you've done is to go back and change. It's also just something I know really well, but I think it's pretty well suited for this kind of thing. So that's it. Thanks.